Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Well, hello there. It's Zoe Routh, your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership futurist. I love to work with leaders and teams to figure out what's on the horizon. What do we need to plan for? And what kind of leadership do we need to meet the demands of the future? And the future is everything we are talking about today as we drill into what gets in the way of us thinking about the future. My guest today is Rachel Audige. She is an author and she is a consultant in the world of innovation and creativity. And she really goes to town in helping organizations unearth their blinkered biases, their biases that blinker them, and figure out the strategies, the creative strategies and innovations that can help bust those blinkered biases to come up with new and innovating ideas. You see, the future, that's me throwing her book around. It's so good. It's such a great book. And her book is Unblinkered, The Quirky Biases That Get in the Way of Creative Thinking and How to Bust Them. You see, the future requires us to do things differently. And you know what gets in the way? Our biases get in the way. We are blinkered and we are unconscious of this. And so Rachel's work is all about helping us turn the X-ray onto what those biases might be so that we can start imagining a different future and responding to it. A future without fossil fuels, for example, a future of a farm in a changing climate, or how we might live and work in irreversible climate change, which is one of the premises I explore in my novel, The Olympus Project. The other thing I want to remind you of before we get stuck into the interview, which is juicy, is that we have our own event, The Future of Leadership, coming up in a couple of weeks here in Canberra on the 24th of February. And we are going to be teasing apart and having some profound conversations about the future of leadership and addressing the kinds of things that we need to imagine and contend with as we move forward into this uncertain arena of what is on the horizon. So join us. Go on to zoerouth.com, click on events. You will find the future of leadership there. So grab your tickets. There are still some seats left. Would love to see you. So without further ado, let's get on to talking about unblinkered biases and what the future might hold if we get past this. Here we go. The interview with Rachel Audige. Well, we have a special, delightful guest all the way from Melbourne. Welcome to the show, Rachel Audige.
Thank you, Zoe. Beautifully said.
Any chance I get to practice my French accent, I will do it because it's so rare here in Australia. And just before the show, we were talking about, grew up in Australia and then spent 20 years in France, if you say with an Aussie accent, France, and then back here in Australia. How the heck did you get to here, where you are a published author of the book Unblinkered, which is fabulous, which I think does a brilliant job of marrying creative thinking, design thinking with addressing unconscious bias. So we're going to dive into that in just a second. So how did you get to this, where you're doing this kind of consulting around strategy, especially with taking into mind cognitive biases, from when you departed Australia as a young 20-year-old? So tell me about that little journey.
The potted history. Well, I have done 2013. So the back and forth, it's a bit I've started writing a book called The Boomerang Effect, which is literally that, spinning off and coming back, which many people have done. But what did I do? I left at 21 and I dived into marketing consulting, and I was working for the Kiwis over in Paris for 7 or 8 years, started having a family.
Wait, you were working for New Zealanders in Paris?
Yeah, I was.
Okay.
Yeah,
because you can.
Yeah, it sounds random, doesn't it? Yeah. So, just stumbled across. I thought it was actually Austrade, and in fact, it was the New Zealand Trade Development Board, and it was wonderful. I have a huge admiration for the New Zealand brand in many ways, ranging from how they've handled the All Blacks. I got some work with Sir Peter Black back in the day, and their politics and so on and so on. Their ability to stand out and take a firm stand on so on. I love them. Anyway, I worked with them for about 7 years. And that was my first job, and that was in marketing consulting. We then moved to Lyon, which was a very happy place for us as a family. We had by then 3 children, and I was working in brand journalism, running a very small editing team in Publicis. And from there was recruited into a company that was back then Aventus and became Bayer. And I was brought in to do one thing and I turned it into something else, which I tend to do. So I was brought in to do communications, and they needed big brands. They needed global brands for the division. And so I set up the head of global branding, and that was me. And so I created some big brands for the company back in the day. And then got on the radar of a CEO over here in the same company who brought me back as a French expat into Australia. So back in 2009, we pulled the 3 kids out of school, and hubby accepted to move, and we moved back in 2009. It's funny, Zoe, because I was thinking about the commonalities about, all of these roles. And I was thinking it was interesting in terms of leadership. They tended to be leadership through influence or leadership through expertise as opposed to through hierarchy. Here in Melbourne, I had a small team, but often I was really in a sort of functional leadership role. And the other thing that struck me is that in all of the roles, there was something about shifting ideas. I was bringing New Zealand products to France when they didn't know they needed them. I was working on nuclear in brand journalism for Publicis and other products that people didn't necessarily know they needed. I was then in biotech, GM, which people definitely didn't think they needed. And then later here was working on brands and so on in an organization that believed that R&D was everything, didn't understand marketing, didn't understand brands. And somewhere in all of that, in around 2005, I stumbled across 2 facilitators from Tel Aviv, and they talked about the biases, the resistance that was, or they came up with the word, they gave me the word for the resistance that I had experienced in most of those experiences. So cognitive fixedness, which I'm sure I'll touch on again. And that was the beginning of a relationship with an organization called SIT. And that explains a little bit what I do today, which is working for myself, a solopreneur, and going into organizations and giving them a different search engine. Helping them scan for their biases and unearth, using what they have, unearth richer ideas and so on, and help them be more efficient innovators.
Fantastic. And there's a couple of little threads I want to pull on a little bit here. Because when you said it, when you looked at the trends across or the things that tied your experiences together, it was really about shifting ideas. And underneath that is potentially shifting values and trying to influence with that. And I love how you then noticed that, that's not so easy. And that people have resistance, and you've decided or identified those as cognitive biases as part of the resistance. So, so much to get through here. It's like chomping at the bit. Which one to start with? Let's start with the big question, which I know a lot of listeners will be asking. Well, how do you actually scan for biases in your workplace? Everybody knows that there's unconscious biases. There's multitudes of them. How do we actually make visible what is invisible and what we're unconscious to? How do we do that?
Oh, wow. Shall we start by naming some of these biases?
Yeah, go for it.
If I name a couple, maybe then I can explain how they might be scanned for. I've spoken of cognitive fixedness, and this was the one that has become my sweet spot and got me interested in biases in the first place and was the trigger for Unblinkered. So cognitive fixedness is a hard thing that doesn't roll off the tongue, does it?
No.
Cognitive fixedness is our tendency to lock stuff in. It's a state of stuckness. It's our tendency to not be able to see alternatives for something. And you can imagine how that might be problematic when you are trying to innovate, trying to do stuff differently, or trying to plan or imagine or shape the future. And I think we both know that if we're trying to have any impact on the future, we need to be able to do things differently. And we're going to need to do things differently in the future. particularly if we're planet friendly and we care about the planet and so on. There are some very big things to do differently. So one of the first things to do is get aware of it. But with cognitive fixedness, what I discovered is that there are tools that actually help us scan for it, help us to explore to see whether we've missed some stuff. And it can be that simple. So what I do with teams with cognitive fixedness is I'm scanning in general for 3 different types of fixedness. One is structural, where they've locked stuff into a structure. And it might be processes, it might be design, it might be a product. One is functional, where people have missed, they have a tendency to sort of not be able to imagine alternative function for something. And one is relational. And there are different ways of scanning for each of them using different sorts of thinking tools.
Can I just clarify something, please, Rachel? What is relational fixedness?
Yeah, I'll explain each one. So relational fixedness is our tendency to lock relationships in or dependencies in. For example, if I say to you, the more you buy, Zoe, the less you pay, you'll go, yep, there's a relationship that I have locked in that I just take as a given. But what if during COVID times and when everyone was hoarding sanitizer, what if we'd flipped that? And what if we'd said the more you buy, the more you pay? Wouldn't that have been better in Holland, or I think it was in Denmark? That's exactly what they did. So sanitizer became a different model. It was sold with a different sort of business model. And there are instances where we found ways of creating different sorts of dependencies, different sorts of relationships with things. Calvin Klein, right now you can't smell me, but I smell of Calvin Klein one. And that perfume was breaking a fixedness we had between gender and perfume. And, think of the power of knowing how to imagine new relationships between things or break relationships that we see as a given. And so cognitive fixes is really around that. It is our tendency to lock stuff in. And just by the way, one thing I always say in workshops is this is not a disease and this is not a sign of stupidity. It's our power. And it's often what makes these smart people, I'm always going into rooms of smart people. It's generally what makes, it's part of their smarts. And I'll say to them, hey, 95% of the time, this is serving you really well. It's what's making you go fast. It is your efficiency mode. The problem happens when someone says to you, a leader says to you, a boss says, you need to do things differently. You need to, let's use the word, do things differently, imagine a future, innovate, whatever the words are. And then it's hard because we can't see a different way of doing things.
Yeah, I get it. And that's exactly some of the challenges I'm facing right now with some leaders is they want to do strategic thinking in volatile, uncertain conditions, lots of ambiguity. And it's like, well, we're stuck with this structure and stuck with these processes. How are we going to work around that? As opposed to reimagining the structure and reimagining the function and the relationships, etc. So that's good. So we got 3 broad categories of where people could be stuck, with these assumptions and defaults. How then do you go about unpicking them? So let's pick structural. A structural cognitive fixedness. How do we go about challenging that? How do we go about dismantling it and trying to find something new?
To tell you that, I have to go backwards a little bit. I'd love to just give you the premise of the main method I'm using, which is that it's a little bit of a myth buster, contrary to common thinking, if you like. We tend to think of constraints as being something that stifles innovation and or different thinking. And in fact, it tends to foster it. Creativity loves, thinking differently loves constraints. And we also think of creativity, this is one of the biases I actually talk about, we think of creativity as a talent and not something that can be learned. And I believe it is a talent. I think there are hugely talented creatives, but I also think that you can help people be more efficient in their creative output. And the way you do that is that you harness patterns. And there are so many ways we can grab patterns. There's a beautiful way, which is biomimicry, which is one I don't use, but I love. So it is where we tap into what Mother Nature has shown us to work well. And there's a great story about the Japanese bullet train that was making noise as it came through the tunnel. And I don't know whether it was serendipitous or by planning, but they had a bird expert in the room who was able to give a few characteristics of birds, and they were able to redesign the train. So using nature, the patterns of nature. Now, the method I use is founded on the observation of 5 patterns that cover 80% of the best ideas. And these patterns have been reverse engineered into thinking tools. And that's what we plug into whatever you're working on. So if you said to me, Zoe, I'm working with a team, hey, they just want to look at some of their HR processes and they're looking at onboarding or something like that, we would step out. We'd start by saying what's in their closed world, what's inside the box, what are the resources they have. So let's look at that. So if it's a process, let's step it out. If it's a product, let's detail all its bits. But let's take a process, we step it out, and then I'll think, I suspect there's structural fixedness there. They've probably locked that in and imagined it can't be any different. So I'm going to use a tool called division. And that simply says that something is moved in time or space. And I'll grab a step and I'll move it randomly in time or space, and I will hit their fixedness hard. And there'll be this sort of unease in the room, and they'll say, this is nonsense, and what's this girl doing here, and da-da-da-da-da. And there'll be that resistance, and then you facilitate that through with the right questions, in what situation would this work, who could this be beneficial for, desirability, feasibility, viability. And by the end, you've got someone saying, hang on, if we do that, that takes out that step, that removes that step, we realize that that's redundant, and off we go. And I've seen this in major projects, a big oil and gas project in Perth and others, saving millions of dollars simply because we had shuffled things around. We'd made something that seemed set in stone, malleable.
I really am excited by that. Could you tell me a little bit more about that example that you just gave, if you can, without divulging confidential information, about how taking this process and outlining the steps of a particular process, unearthing perhaps a structural fixedness piece there, using division to take all the steps, and basically what I'm understanding is move some of the steps around so that instead of going step 1, 2, 3, 4, it's step 6, 8, 2, 1. And then go, how does that work? Is that sort of the process you use? Is that, got it?
Yeah, let's go back. Go back to that notion of patterns. I'll give you a couple of examples of where we see this division pattern. And this is all we're doing. We're saying, wow, in great ideas, this works. So H&M, I think it was in New York, was having problems with customer satisfaction. And what was happening was just think of a classic shopping process where you and I go shopping together. We go into H&M, and forget it's H&M, it could be any clothing shop, but it happens that they did this. And we go in and we browse around, we find a couple of things, we go in the fitting room, we try it on, we pick a couple of items, we then queue up, and then we pay. Now, what was happening was people were standing in the queue for ages, and they were dumping their items and walking out. So they had the smarts to go, hey, let's move the payment step to the fitting room. And customer satisfaction went through the roof without changing anything else, obviously, with a little bit of a technology change. So putting iPads or, the appropriate technology in the fitting room. But also they were losing less sales, and they had less pressure at the counters, and so on and so on. And you can see that in a way Apple did something similar when they created multiple options to sell. Basically anyone you're speaking to is able to take payment, so a different sort of movement. So that sort of pattern is something we can see is successful in different sorts of things. Another example in a product is the classic Heinz tomato sauce bottle, where conceptually the lid has moved from the top to the bottom. And that we see as a division.
Like a squeezy bottle.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
okay.
You've got the lid that's moved. Now, you take that in pieces that they have moved a lid from top to bottom, because lids were always on top. And so you go top to bottom and you go, okay. And the questioning would have been, had they used SIT, the question would be, that's weird. I've moved from the step or the component from top to bottom. Who would want that? What would it be good for? Can we do it? How do, is it worth doing? Is it viable? The classic desirability, feasibility, viability, adaptations, and then we test. So that's the flip. What we're doing that's odd is that we're plugging in something strange, suspending for a moment that fixedness, and then later bringing in insights and knowledge we have of the market, the customer, and so on and so on. But we are doing that to suspend, as I said, that fixedness. So that's division. Another one is subtraction, where we take away something essential. And if you think about it, sorry to use Apple again, but to go from iPod to the Shuffle is a nice idea. To take, when I wear my contact lenses, I've taken away what we thought was essential from my glasses to get to my contact lenses. These are really nice examples of subtraction. What if the thing that is getting us stuck is in fact something that we've decided is essential? Well, what if we force ourselves to take it away? We might just unearth something that was staring us in the face. So those are examples of structural fixedness, and we are all prone to it. And it's, as I said, it's not about being daft or anything like that. It is part of our smarts, part of our efficiency. But how could we, shouldn't we have ways of scanning for this to make sure that we haven't missed something and left value on the table before we go off and experiment and test and prototype and so on and so on? So for me, it's about having less bad ideas, having really good ideas at the get-go before you even hit the experimentation phase.
Mm-hmm. I really found this absolutely fascinating. And two questions come up. The first one is that cognitive dissonance that happens, right? That sort of that little piece of, because it's jarring when you do any of this, where you take something out, mix something up, and it's out of the defaults. It's no longer a default. It's something new and different. And you have to suspend, as you say, at the beginning. How do you create the space for people to move through that? Because the reason I'm asking that is people really hang on to their sacred cows because they're familiar, they're comfortable. So what do you do either in the lead up or throughout the process to help them feel okay with slaughtering those sacred cows?
No, it's a fantastic question. Dealing with the unconscious, as you said, and once when we're talking therapy here, dealing with unconscious bias, as you guessed at the start, or as you asserted at the start, is hard. And navigating that is delicate. I believe that any new thinking or shifting thinking, I'm skirting around that word innovation because we're a bit tired of it, but any sort of innovative thinking means embracing resistance. You will get resistance. So how do you harness that? How do you work with it? And I think that often means addressing it head on. One of the biases I speak about in the book is the status quo bias, which is this tendency we have to just be so fond of the existing. And this is playing in. It's not pure fixedness. A lot of these biases are sort of colliding as we're thinking. In fact, I read that we have about 36 biases at play just when we're trying to innovate, and I think about 100 every time we start thinking. So they're all colliding with each other. Yeah, but there are plenty going on. So back to the fixedness question. In a situation like that, it is about sitting with it, winning over a certain amount. I guess this is possibly where leadership is really important. The type of leadership I do today is holding a room, very often holding a room, and leading their thinking in a certain direction. I guess it's leading that search engine through their mind and honoring their thinking and stepping back and letting it happen, but holding the space for them to have that resistance and then pushing, knowing when to push through. So I often start with the proof of fixedness with exercises that are away from them. So I'll give them examples. For example, structural fixedness, the classic that we've always talked about with structural fixedness is the fridge. So I'll draw a little box and then a rectangle and say, what's that? And if I've drawn it properly, they'll say, well, it's a fridge. And you'll say, how do you know it's a fridge? And they'll say, well, and we'll say, isn't it funny? We stayed with the fridge with the coldest part on top way past its use-by date. Why did we do that? Why did we lock in that configuration when, in fact, technology enabled us to have fridge drawers and split fridges and freezers on the bottom and all sorts of things? And that was a type of structural fixedness. So, examples like that, I'm showing you right now, listeners can't see, but a QWERTY keyboard. Now, you and I speak French. In French, it's a ZERTY. In other languages, it's something else. And you say to them, well, why? And they'll look at that and some of them will know that it's from the typewriter. And the typewriter meant that when we typed at speed on a typewriter, there were certain letters that would catch. And so we reorganized it so they wouldn't. Now, that was a great solution. So we ended up with QWERTY for English keyboards. But it's irrelevant on this little guy here, this little Apple keyboard, or any other branded keyboard. So we've locked this stuff in. And by the way, there is a keyboard that is way more efficient, way more ergonomic, faster, and so on and so on. The Dvorak keyboard.
Do people use the Dvorak keyboard? I'm curious.
Some people use it. And I noted the other day when I got a new phone that it was proposed. So yeah, there is some use of it, but you look at it, you and I would look at it and go, ooh, I don't want to learn on that. It's not something we used to. So it would take a little bit of learning. So to answer your question, that getting their heads around this thing, that it exists, that it isn't as a disease, that it's something that is prevalent and that can be costing us, because often it's one thing to say, isn't this an interesting aha moment and you didn't know about this? It's another to say this matters. And to get them to realize that we might be wasting huge amount of money because we've got stuck on something in a certain way, or we've missed all these opportunities. That's when you start to get their interest. And then it's just by playing with it and having them have their own experience of it and realize coming up against their own fixedness and their own little moments of, wow, I hadn't seen that. And very quickly you win them over. Yeah.
I love it. So that's great. So you basically highlight the advantages of doing it and the missed opportunities if you don't, as a key sort of motivator there to move into and push into the discomfort of seeing things differently, experimenting with them. One of the things I'm interested too is it's inspiring to hear about successes, things that work well. What about if you've had times where you've worked with organizations to challenge their default thinking and it's kind of fallen flat, or you've had a type of leadership failure? Can you tell me about a time when that happened?
My personal leadership failure or failure of what I've been doing?
Either. I'll give you a choice.
Yeah. Couple of instances. So personal leadership failure, I mentioned my little potted history and said that it was a lot about influence and so on. And I'm one of those people who loves new ideas and novelty and driving stuff and so on. And one of the things I did very poorly, and like to think I do it better now, but I did very poorly, was letting other people think for themselves. And it's the thing that I treasure the most in my facilitation. I love stepping back and looking after their best thinking. And yet as a leader, I think it's where I often failed. I would often be jumping in and doing what Liz Wiseman calls so beautifully, that diminishing, where you're there trying to be smart for them. And it's often well-intentioned, not always. Sometimes it's a bit ego or speed-oriented. But yeah, so that sort of thing of just jumping in, doing thinking for them and basically diminishing their thinking and them. And I think that Nancy Klein, I got very passionate about her work over COVID. She talks a lot about how you can sabotage other people's thinking when you step in, when you interrupt their thinking and so on. So yeah, that's certainly been one of my areas of work, areas to work on. And in terms of areas where I felt that I had failed to have the impact or bring the value that I wanted to bring with the sort of work that I'm doing now, I think I have a daughter who's a doctor. I think that you have to be fairly humble, that you're not walking in and you don't win every time. I mean, she's certainly experiencing that every time. But sometimes you can lead someone to water and you can't make them drink. It's the classic story. So I've had instances when we have come up with what seemed to me to be really good ideas. We've put them up on a 2x2 matrix and we've decided that that's the low-hanging fruit and they're the winning ones. And yet they were going to rock the boat too much. And so the client and or the leaders I was working with at the time in my own company, in my corporate days, chose not to act. So that's hard. And as I say, it's happened when I was inside the company and outside. In other instances, I've been working on big projects with big schedules, and a player in the team has just said, this is a great idea, but it's too late. And that idea of good ideas too late is very interesting for me, very, very frustrating. But I think it highlights the importance of scanning for bias earlier.
Can I ask you about that one, Rachel?
Yeah.
The good idea that was too late, why was it too late?
Because we're talking about big oil and gas projects where schedule is everything. You're moving along with massive costs and stage gates, and there's a certain point where you can't suddenly reconfigure the deck of a floating structure, So while they've realised that there's a danger on board and they need to, and they've called in people to think about it differently or take weight off or whatever, it's actually too late to do certain things because the architects have already built a level or whatever. I'm sort of trying to keep it general. But yeah, it's really that case of a great idea too late. And I've certainly seen that. And look, to be honest, there are also instances when it's just felt where people were just ticking a box. I mean, we know that innovation is very à la mode, and not everyone is serious about and committed to acting on the ideas and implementation. So
that goes to my next question about what you explained too, is that one of the failures was the suggestions would rock the boat too much, and you as a championing change maker was deflected. Why do you think it rocked the boat too much in terms of what was that resistance? Was it an unconscious bias, or was it just too scary a change, or what were the contributing factors there?
In the instance I was talking about, it was going to modify, it was challenging the distribution channel. And so it felt too scary. I think there was a real fear of loss of margin and, perhaps short-term, perhaps long-term, medium-term loss. So genuine fear that I think possibly also a habit of playing second innovator, not first innovator, not first mover. Some organizations kind of play it that way. They want someone else to take the risk before them. And I'd say that in this instance, that was a little bit what was happening. But maybe to pick up on another bias that we quickly alluded to, we are irrationally wedded to what we know, and we like stuff to stay the same. And that's that status quo bias. We do like things to stay as they are. And not everyone, we all have different appetites for that. I mean, some listeners will be saying, I'm not like that at all. I love change. And I think that's the issue. Some of us have an appetite for change and in fact thrive on it. But en masse, we observe this status quo bias. And it might be that it's an organizational thing, that there isn't a sort of a way of changing the rules of the procedures. Or if we think leadership, the leaders are not allowing for things to be changed, or they're not fostering any sort of different behaviours, or the resources are so limited to think and pause and revisit things that it's very hard to shift anything, or there's just no culture for that sort of change. You're not allowed to. I know you've addressed this in other conversations. There's no appetite for risk taking. There's those confusing messages: go innovate, but don't make mistakes. The whole you're rewarded for you're pushed for A, but you're punished for A, but rewarded for B. This confusing sort of thing. So, end of year events where all the successes get praised, but no one wants to talk about the mistakes, and all these mixed messages that actually hold people back from change and taking risk and so on. And then personally, some people just really like stability and are tired of fatigue, have that sort of change fatigue and so on. So there's a lot holding us back from modifying things. And that's beyond this fixedness we've been talking about, where we can't even see what could change.
This makes me wonder if the processes that you outline in Unblinkered, which is all about challenging unconscious bias and using these thinking tools to create new innovative systems, products, etc., does it need an ecosystem to land properly? Or does it need a cultural ecosystem to land properly? Like some of what you've just described just then, and when we talk about resistance, I'm making the jump to a potential conclusion, you can challenge me on this if you like, that you actually need a culture setup that would be open and supportive to challenging the thinking. Otherwise, these particular tools are not going to work. Is that a correct diagnosis or assumption or conclusion?
Yeah, I think it is. And I was really interested about that when I stepped out of, there's a lot of great writing on that, Zoe. There's some really interesting theses around what it takes. A lot of people who've dabbled in innovation or dived into innovation or been great innovators have explored what does it take. And I did my little take on that when I left corporate, saying what was the essential mix that was required. And I mention in the book, The Hero's Myth. I talk about this sort of popular mythology that, an entrepreneur, I don't know whether you've come across that term, intrapreneur, but it's quite popular now. Didn't exist back when I was doing innovation in Bayer, but it does now. But an intrapreneur or the entrepreneur, they've done something extraordinary. And we hang on to these sort of Melanie Perkins, Canva sort of ideas, and we zoom in a lot on individuals. But to your point, those examples exist. Great. They certainly are there. But in a mid-sized organization, small, mid, I work with all sorts of sizes. work with a little, immigration agency and some beautiful food and ag organizations and so on. So all sorts of sizes, and then big corporates. Often what they're really needing is this mix of things going on. And where I saw a bit of a flip, there tended to be a sense, leaders tend to think that if they say go innovate, then their work is done. And sort of give the mandate and, say this is the focus and it's innovations in our DNA as we read all over the place. And they sort of feel that that's the impetus. And my take was the opposite. I felt that if you started with method, you started with give them skills, get some runs on the board, really give them some skills, give them the how. Start by giving them the how. Sort of method through to mindset, shift mindset. So bust bias. That's the nail that I run around hammering. So bust bias, be clear on that. Have a notion of innovation that's really broad. Make sure it's not just the lab coats or the colouring in department, as they used to call marketing. Or make sure it's not a specific department that's relegated as set up as the innovators. It should touch every part of the business, and everyone should be skilled up and allowed and given permission to innovate on demand, as we say in systematic inventive thinking. So really innovate on demand and using what they have. And of course, you've got to also foster that courageous organisation where you're being careful about that you're not giving those mixed messages. So my take is that's the above the line stuff. And after, of course, you need the support, the focus, the resources. You need ongoing sort of support from the leadership. And then from there, sustained communication and measurement and everything. And that flow on, I create a little bit of a circle to just say that's your mix. And if you tie all that up, you have all those. I've actually got 12 pieces in there. If you tie all that up, then or if you've got all those things on the radar, you are more likely to succeed. And by the way, Zoe, it's funny, I mentioned SIT once or twice. One thing that I got really passionate about when I stepped out, I started working over at as a guest speaker at UTS, went into the Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation. And a lot of unis are doing some really great work, and I was really impressed with what Bemla Hunt was putting together there, this amazing course. And the students were the cream of the crop across all the different disciplines, learning methods in creativity, innovation, problem solving, and so on. And it really woke up for me the importance of giving people a myriad of ways of solving problems and many ways of doing things. And I sort of went back to working for clients thinking, you can't just have the law of their instrument. You can't fall in love with one method. It's not going to be enough. You need another bias that's at play a lot. You see sort of three big methods out there. Let's call them broadly design thinking, agile, and some version of lean. And there's so much more out there. There's so much more in terms of methods and mindset. And I would love to see organizations putting together what I call an innovation shadow board. A little bit like my dad had with his, all the tools. Remember those things with all the tools on a shadow board, silhouetted on a board, and you'd know where to put the spanner and you'd know where to put the saw and so on? It's a bit like that, just going, well, what do I grab when? Is this a job for a screwdriver, or is this a job for a saw? Is this a process that needs slicing into, or does it need, is it a widget type job where I need to go in and check out it? And just sort of being armed with different sorts of methods, including bias busting methods that enable you to, think differently.
I really like that metaphor. It's a really good visual image. And I think that actually would be a really useful thing to create, is actually a pictorial representation of the tools that you've got in your book. That would be really, really quite helpful. First of all, it's really helpful that we identified structural, functional, and relational fixedness. And then in your book, you've got a subset of tools that can help us debunk some of those cognitive constraints. I also have a question for you about this model here, the innovation wheel. Can you see that from your book? Yeah. Is that your particular model that you work with, that you've come up with?
Yeah. So that's a little online tool that I've put. So that's basically capturing the mix I was talking about.
Yeah.
So that is capturing what I just went through. And what I've got is a little online quiz and people can go in and just see what their heat map looks like. So are they currently really good on skills but quite poor on results, or have they not got the processes? They've got some good skills but poor processes, or is resourcing really bad? And basically using from hot to cool colors, just say, yep, you're cruising in the cool colors, or hey, this is a hot spot, let's have a look at it. And most of the time, people don't take out the cool colored textures. If that were in the days that I used to draw this, it was textures. Nowadays, when they come back, if you fill that in, you'll just get your own little wheel. Generally, they are pretty hot looking, usually in the red, orange, and yellows. Yeah.
Okay, so the hot looking means that they're not doing so well.
No. The cooler colors is when it's getting chilled and more integrated.
So for the listener, what we'll do is the model is called the Innovation Wheel, and it comprises method, mindset, momentum, and mandate. It's a self-assessment tool. We'll put the link in the show notes for people so they can hop on to the assessment on your site and get their own little diagnostic around that as a starting point for what's working, what's not working, which is great because that's a really great little roadmap then that people can have in terms of what they need to build up and focus on either in their own portfolio or across their team or across their organization. That's a really good starting point. It's a really good little diagnostic.
It's a really nice conversation piece. It doesn't give what we were just talking about, which is another layer. And it's probably my next book, Zoe, and it was the one I was going to write during COVID. And it is probably talking with lots of experts about different methods and mindsets and applying them to, say, one or two problems, and it's sort of half written, and really just showing how they work and what you get from them in a as unbiased a way as possible.
Yeah.
And hey, we all fall into our biases. So obviously I have plenty.
Can I just clarify too, like you said, you talk about mindsets in plural terms. Can you give us an example of what is a sample mindset in your context?
Yeah. So one of the mindsets that I have really embraced strongly is a growth mindset. And I love the fact that I spend a lot of my time, because we are doing inside the box thinking, we start with the premise that we will work with the resources we already have. We call that closed world thinking in SIT. That's incredibly resourceful. And I find that I'm spending a lot of time showing people they are richer than they think. And that in itself is very growth mindset. The problem-solving tool that I use is a beautiful one, which ends up showing that the problem may well be a resource. And then I can take that, we're talking strategy and leadership, you can then take that thinking, once you've learnt that thinking, that starts to creep into, in a positive way, starts to creep into things like the classic SWOT or a business model canvas or other tools that people are using. And you start to be able to harness them in a different way and look at a threat in a different way and flip it around and see, well, how could that threat be even more positive or harnessed as a resource and so on. So, yeah, I think that growth mindset for me is a very positive one. I think that the closed world mind or constraint mindset, using what we have, is another one to really be going into things with that sort of mindset of we will use only what we have. It's one of our principles, but I also see that as a mindset.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I needed those examples. That was really helpful. So coming to the end of the show a little bit, 2 last questions. For somebody listening in, what would be your key tip to get started with looking at your unconscious biases or moving into creativity and innovation?
I think there are two words come to mind, and they're words we overuse. Well, the first one is, but I'll explain them. I think diversity, but I'll be clear. Diversity, if you have diverse people in the room, it is the basic way of scanning for biases. It is the most basic way. You start there. You want to have a diverse group of people in the room. What better way to check our own thinking than to be up against different codes, different styles, different gender, everything. So that would be the first thing. If you can't do anything else, have a diverse people in the room and constantly seek out that diversity, and then, of course, ensure the mix with inclusion. So that would be a big one for me. Diversity is your big thing. And then I would go to that second thing we've talked about, which is diversity of methods. So don't approach things in one way. I've had a couple of situations, we were talking about failures. I had one situation where we had some beautiful work underway, and I suddenly heard that there was a method, which I won't name, that was going to become the only method in the company, which basically meant I exited. Now, that's very sad for me, but I think it's very sad for the organization, because they are then going to get, an approach to something, and each method has its sweet spots. So have multiple tools, work out where they're working, what their sweet spots are. And I don't think one size fits all. I think it depends on, whether we're working with production lines. It depends on the complexity of our processes. It depends on so much. So yeah, that diversity of methods, and then just that curiosity. Be curious. So diversity and curiosity, diversity of in the room, diversity of methods, and then curiosity. I mentioned in the book Anne Kerwin's Ignorance Map. And it's that beautiful exploration of known unknowns and unknown knowns, unknown unknowns, and so on. And that checklist, even if you don't, follow your finger around this question mark that is her map, just having that exploration of busting assumptions, constantly saying, have I challenged my assumptions? If I haven't, this is a bad idea. Until I have, this is not an idea I'll take anywhere. So challenging assumptions, busting biases, and being curious about what I might be missing, I think is fundamental. Yeah, and I think that readiness to unlearn and be comfortable, you mentioned ambiguity and so on, I guess just get comfortable with exploring the unknown would be really, really, really important. Yeah.
That's a very important mindset and approach.
It is.
Last question. So your favorite book or podcast for developing professionally?
Oh, I think like a lot of people, I was very, very impacted by Perez's Invisible Women. Oh, Zoe, it's wonderful. So she's done a huge piece of research, and she's looking into where data bias has led to design that is not helpful for women.
Oh, yes.
And it's wonderful. And it's a real interest. I'm really interested in how this plays out in the medical world and so on. I've just recently blogged on mammography equipment and things, just saying, hey, how do we design for us? But I think that we really want to be asking, in any innovation, in any sort of future thinking about ideas and so on, we want to be asking, who does this idea exclude? So beyond women, she's focused on women, but beyond women, we need to be asking that question. I have an image that is that symbolically or quite tangibly, we all need to be able to go through the front door. We can't be doing these fixes later saying, oh, blimey, we've got to push that wheelchair's got to go around the side, or that, you know what I mean? It shouldn't be a fix later on, or gee, no one could click on this button that we've put there on our website, or someone who's colorblind wouldn't even see it, or whatever. These things should be thought through before. So yeah, I think that notion of really, really having that universal design. Hers is very challenging, and that was a great one. And the other one I mentioned is Nancy Klein's More Time to Think, which is a terrific piece on just how do we help people to think well around us, which in itself is a very powerful quest.
Thank you so much. I always love great book recommendations, and I have my own book recommendation in your book, Unblinkered, The Quirky Biases That Get in the Way of Creative Thinking and How to Bust Them. Rachel, where can people find out more about you and your work?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm blogging quite relatively regularly on LinkedIn. I try to bring topics of interest and not be salesy, because I'm a bit tired of that on LinkedIn. And I've got a website, so with my name, so www.rachelaudige.com. And be delighted to keep exploring this. And then, of course, Unblinkered is available on my website, and I'll put a little signature on it, and it's also on Amazon.
Fantastic, Rachel. This has been really fabulous. Just a really deep dive into some of the important methodologies and mindsets that we need to tackle our thinking if we are to meet the future and to create a future that's worth living in. So thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your wisdom and expertise.
Thanks, Zoe.
That was such a rich conversation, and I just wanted to keep digging into the methodologies, the strategies, the mindset, the principles, all the resources that Rachel was alluding to and diving into a little bit. We kept talking after we hit the end record button, And one of the things that we need to make sure is clear is that we started talking about cognitive fixedness, and it is just one of the biases that occurs for us. And there are several others in Rachel's book, Unblinkered. So cognitive fixedness is not the only bias out there. There's heaps. And she unpacks so many more of them in her book, Unblinkered, and offers strategies to combat them so that we can actually start imagining the future. So if you're struggling with what's coming and how do we invent things and how do I come up with a new idea, this is definitely a great book for you, Unblinkered by Rachel Audige. There's a lot of work to be done, and we need all of our brains to do the thinking, the unblinkered thinking to contend with what's coming. Can't wait to do more of this with you. If you enjoyed the show and you want to talk about it, feel free to email me, zoe@zoerouth.com, or hop onto LinkedIn or any of our social media platforms to start a conversation about this. And be sure to join us at the Future of Leadership in Canberra here on the 24th of February, 2023. Would love to go deeper on this conversation about the future and especially what kind of leadership we need for the future. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.